We're going to start up again, a little bit ahead of schedule, but I'd like to have as much time for discussion as possible. We're missing Isabella.
She hasn't disappeared entirely, I hope, but not likely. I think she went to reinforce herself with some vodka. Well, that's not the way she does it usually. That's not the way.
Get a little tighter up here.
Who else is going to talk?
Guy Laron. He will talk at the other end, and then we'll go to discussion. Okay, there she is. Well, I have the great pleasure to welcome back the panelists from the first panel, but in particular to welcome Ambassador Richard Parker, who will serve as a commentator on this panel. He'll be followed by Guy Laron. Again, biographies for both are available outside. Do let me advertise in that Guy is the author of a CWIHP working paper, Cutting the Gordian Knot, the post-World War II Egyptian Quest for Arms and the 1955 Czechoslovak Arms Deal. It's available outside and on our website as well. With that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Parker for his comments.
What do I do when this laptop is up here? Just leave it there?
Pull it aside.
Okay, first of all, I want to know, is a fox bat a real animal? Is there such a thing as a fox bat? Has anyone here ever seen one? Hold your hand up if you have. What's that? It is in the National Geographic? Okay. Well, I have never seen one. But if you look up foxbat on the Google, there's a very interesting set of pictures of the aircraft and discussion of its capabilities, which were extreme. I'm a little picture man. I have trouble seeing, as Sam Lewis out there will know, I have trouble seeing the big picture sometimes. For me, history is a result of irrational events. Incompetence rather than malevolence is the ruling factor. The Israeli attack on the morning of June 5th, for instance, succeeded so successfully because the UAR Air Force was all on the ground and their anti-aircraft defenses were all shut down. This is because Marshal Amr, the commander of the army, was scheduling an inspection trip of installations in Sinai for that day. And he didn't want to get shot down by his own people. Had the UAR aircraft been up, as they should have been, I think the outcome would have been different. The Israelis would still have won, but the defeat would not have been nearly as crushing. I would also like to say, with reference to Yaakov Roy's remarks about the Soviets and the Egyptians, there wasn't anything inferior about the Soviet military equipment given to Egypt. There were specific items, I'm sure, that the Israelis thought were inferior to their own, but in general, it was good stuff. And there wasn't anything really wrong with the Soviet military training. Soviet doctrine probably was not as fully adapted as one would like for warfare and for desert warfare, but 1973, the October War, showed that the Egyptians, with proper leadership, could put up a very good fight. The problem with Egypt, the Egyptian army, Syrian army, all Arab armies, has always been one of leadership. Except for the Jordanian army, the leadership has been poor. Amr had appointed his favorites to key jobs in the military establishment in the Sinai, and they were incompetent and unable to cope with the emergency that began with the Israeli attack. It's interesting that Nasser himself did not know the state of the army. He did not know what had happened. He didn't know that that Amr, on the second day, had ordered a complete retreat, a rapid retreat, immediate retreat. If he had opted to stay in the passes, the Sinai passes, as Nasser thought the plan called for him to do, the outcome again would have been different. So Amr had paid for this afterwards. He committed suicide. The Egyptians say in Taharu, they suicided him. I mean, okay. I'm not a Soviet expert, although looking around this room, I bet I had contacts with the Soviet army before anybody else in this room did. In 1945. Can anybody else beat 1945? You're too young. You can't do it. Okay. Well, all right. Except for this fellow. I had no claim to expertise, and I'm not really. I've read the book, the Fox-Vat book, and I can't. It's a hard read. There's a lot of material in there. They've done a lot of work. I can't really evaluate it. Some Soviet expert will have to do that. What the Soviets are saying, how real it is. One thing that impresses me, this was supposed to have been a cabal between the Soviets and the Egyptians, but there isn't much evidence of Soviet participation in it. It's all this, of Egyptian participation in it. The Egyptians are missing from this account. It was clear to me, clear to us at the time, that the Egyptians were implementing a contingency plan. Amr wanted to get rid of UNIF. He had for some time, and this was seen as an opportunity. What he thought we were going to accomplish with this, I don't know. But the Egyptians were full of confidence that they were going to wipe out much of Israel. A Lebanese journalist came to me one day in my office in Cairo. I was the political counselor of the embassy there, and she said, "The only question is at what point you were going to intervene to stop the march on Tel Aviv." And we noted this confidence, the Egyptian confidence. We sent a telegram. Says this it's rather strange. We've been wondering. They're acting as though they had a secret weapon. Well, this was just after the CIA had just given this final scrub to President Johnson, saying that it was clear that if the Arabs started fighting first, it'd go on longer, but the Israelis would win sooner or later. So we immediately got a telegram back from Washington. It says, "Secret weapon? What secret weapon?" Well, of course, there was none. But you couldn't tell the Egyptians that. They thought they had Israel on the ropes. On page 30 of her book, Isabella Ginor says Parker didn't have any the subject of Israel's nuclear capability did not come up at all in Parker's discussions with the Egyptians. Well, one reason I'm sure it didn't come up was because we had, on orders from Washington, assured everybody that the Russians had that the Israelis had no plutonium separation facilities at Dimona and were not on the route to making a bomb. Now, this is a result of 2 visits by this distinguished panel of scientists who went out there and had the wool pulled over their eyes by the Israelis. The Israelis lied to us about it, and we didn't know it. It's one of 2 major lies told us by the Israelis. The other was Abba Eban's claim that the Egyptians had started the fighting, not Israel. Anyway, the Arabs, I think, took us our assurances rather seriously. I'm confused about the 2 planes flying over Dimona because Marshal Amer took credit for that on one occasion, and in the events leading up to the war. And I assume he's talking about Egyptian planes, not Soviet. I mean, were there overflights by the Soviets? There were 2 overflights. Were they both by Soviets, or one by Soviets, or one by Egyptians? I don't know. Is Avner Cohen in the audience?
Yeah, I'm here.
Huh? Where are you? Oh, okay. Well, maybe he'll speak about that.
היו גם מטוסים מצרים?
Well, I can't read my writing. I wrote down something down here. Oh, yeah, no, I've said that already. Okay, well, all I'm saying is that on the question of the Soviet warning, which started the conflict, as one of the Rostov brothers said to the Russian ambassador, "You've just thrown a match into the haystack," and it went right up. Nobody I know of in the area in the spring of 1967 expected a war. There was tension on the border with Syria, but there was always tension on the border with Syria. And we didn't really expect any kind of war. It was a big surprise to us, and I think to everybody else. The question was, we assumed immediately that the Russians had confected this report because we knew it wasn't true. And why did they do it? I went out to Egypt a few years later, and I went around asking people, why do you think the Soviets lied to you? Foreign minister, and various people in the foreign ministry, Vice President Zakaria Mohideen, and so forth. Why did they lie to you? Well, they all responded, we don't think they lied. We think they believed the report. If so, where did it come from? Now, there were there's some reference to Israeli troop movements, small troop movements in the area. This could have started something. But the funny thing is that the chief of staff went up from Cairo to Syria, General Fauzi, and drove over the border area and came back and said there are no troop concentrations. And this was dismissed. The Egyptians paid no attention to it, which means to me that at least Marshal Amer was going to push this thing no matter what. Was he in on the report? Is he at the source of it? One of the Egyptian generals who was in Sinai said the source of this was the Soviet military attaché in Beirut. Well, I can tell you, as an old Near East hand, I believe that immediately. That's it. He's hanging out in the bar of the San George Hotel, and somebody fed him this, and he reported it to Moscow, and they were off to the races. I think, and I can't prove it, that the Soviets got a hold of some bad intelligence and didn't analyze it properly and went with it when they should not have done so. Because again, I think this was a question of incompetence rather than of serious intent to start a war. But I defer to the Soviet experts in the audience for confirmation or denial. Okay, I quit. Question.
Okay, thank you, certainly for staying within the time limit, and I hope you'll there'll be opportunity to speak later. Now we'll go from Ambassador Parker, who was there at the time, to the youngest participant on the panel, who
Wasn't
may
there-
not
who
have-
wasn't there- who wasn't
wasn't
there at
even
the time?
alive, but who, that's right, who wasn't even born then, but has done a terrific amount of research in the archives and is giving us a brief comment with highlighting some of his own findings. Guy, you've got the
Thank
floor.
you. I hope this works. Okay. I want to start by thanking the organizers of the seminar for the opportunity to speak here today. I want to respond to the excellent papers we have heard by discussing a few key documents from Egyptian and Czech archives. By doing so, I will address the question of Soviet and Egyptian intentions before the war, as well as the reasons for the Arab army's defeat and the ways in which the Soviet bloc sought to use the results of the crisis for its own advantage. 1 week before the war, Egyptian Minister of War Shams Badran and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin met in Moscow on the 26th and the 27th of May. Luckily for us, the full transcripts of the conversation, as recorded by the Egyptian side, were published recently. Some researchers claim that this was the meeting in which Badran coordinated the looming attack against Israel with the Soviet Union. At least in his conversations with Kosygin, he did no such thing. Badran told Kosygin at least 5 times during the conversation that Egypt had no intention of attacking Israel and that Egypt would fight Israel only if it attacked Egypt first. We want nothing more, said Badran, than what we've achieved so far. The unity of the Arab world behind our leadership, control of Sharm el-Sheikh, and the presence of our army in the Sinai. In that sense, Kosygin's advice given during this conversation to Badran to quit while Egypt was ahead was akin to preaching to the convinced. Badran presented the very position at the beginning of the conversation, even before Kosygin presented his. Of course, Kosygin encouraged Egypt in that conversation to stay in Sharm el-Sheikh. Egypt, said Kosygin, needs nothing more than what it already gained from the crisis. Now was the time, he advised Badran, to consolidate your gains by putting forward a proposal that would deal with means to end the crisis peacefully. Otherwise, warned Kosygin, you would leave the field open to Israeli provocations. During their conversation, Badran asked for arms supplies. He said that due to the Egyptian army's full mobilization, the army's depots were empty. Kosygin told Badran that even if the Soviet Union would decide to give these weapons to Egypt, it expected Egypt not to use them to instigate war. Badran reacted by saying that on the contrary, only if Egypt projected an image of overwhelming force would it be able to deter Israel and the US from attacking it. Kosygin agreed with that assessment. The impression that Egypt at that stage of the crisis was willing to consolidate its gains and avoid a war with Israel conforms to 2 other messages that Nasser sent to the American administration, one of which was delivered by Robert B. Anderson, President Johnson's personal envoy to Nasser. The impression that the Soviet Union, while pleased by the achievements of its Egyptian ally, preached caution to its Arab clients during the crisis conforms with Nasser's and Yusuf Zouain's, Syrian prime minister at the time, accusations made after the war to Czechoslovak officials that had the Arabs not listened to Soviet advices not to attack first, they would have ended the war in an improved position. Still, what about the fact that while in Moscow at the end of May, Badran met with Marshal Grechko, Minister of Defense, who famously promised Nasser that if America entered the war, the Soviets would fight with the Egyptians on the same side. However, shortly afterwards, Grechko told the Egyptian ambassador, Murad Ghalib, that he hoped Badran did not make too much of what he said, as this was only, quote, one for the road, unquote, or in other words, this was merely a pep talk. In addition, the transcripts of the conversation between Badran and Kosygin have a small appendix, and that's a report by the same Murad Ghaleb, the Egyptian ambassador to Moscow, about a conversation he had on 27 May with Grechko. In that conversation, Grechko asked Murad Ghaleb whether the issue of a visit by the Syrian president, Nuruddin Atassi, was brought up in the conversation, and Ghaleb affirmed that it was. Well, Grechko said, we don't have time for this, because me and Brezhnev and Kosygin, we are going for a tour that has military aspect, and Podgorny is going to a visit in Afghanistan. Now, my question is, of course, if Grechko is aware at the time that the Soviet fleet is in the Middle East and armed with nuclear weapons, and he's coordinating a war with Syria and Egypt, how come he doesn't welcome the coming of Atassi to Moscow at the time? But that's just a question, not an answer. Soviet and Czechoslovak reports described considerable military inaptitude on the side of their Arab allies during the war. Of course, they had a reason to underline that fact, as they were worried that the results of the war would reflect badly on the reputation of the Soviet weaponry. Indeed, one of the Czechoslovaks' main concerns, even during the war itself, was that the Egyptians would shut down the military technical academy that they had been operating in Cairo since 1958 as a retribution for the poor performance of Soviet and Czechoslovak trained units. Still, it seems that Arab armies were seriously lacking in morale, discipline, and military tactical knowledge. According to what Soviet advisors based in the Syrian army reported to Czechoslovak officials, so unprepared was the Syrian Air Force for its confrontation with Israel that on the 7th of April, in an incident that is now regarded by scholars as one of the events that precipitated the crisis, the 6 Syrian MiGs that were hurriedly dispatched into the air to confront intruding Israeli planes were equipped with only training missiles made of wood. That did not help them much in the air fight that ensued, and these 6 MiGs were shut down. During the war itself, the Syrian Air Force did not perform better. According to one Soviet advisor, in a specific Syrian airfield during the war, there were 20 planes on the ground ready to take off. Yet the Soviet advisor had to threaten the Syrian commander with his fist in order to make him give pilots the order to take off and chase Israeli planes. According to the Soviet advisors, the main reasons for the Syrian defeat were 1. Zero intelligence on the Israeli army, and 2. An inability to communicate properly with the troops. The case of Quneitra was brought as an example. In Quneitra, the Soviet advisors claimed the Syrian army was well placed to defend the city successfully. However, a few Israeli tanks were able to appear behind the first Syrian line of defense. At that point, someone, no one knew who, phoned headquarters and informed them that Quneitra was lost. So headquarters in Damascus phoned the commanding general and told him to retreat. Well, the commanding general, who knew the situation on the ground, said he doesn't want to retreat. He was going to fight, and fight a good fight. So they just repeated their order and told him that he should save his forces for more winnable battles. And so Quneitra was lost without a battle at all. In addition, told the Soviet advisors, for some reason most of the elite tank units were ordered not to engage in combat activity. As Egyptian military blunders are better known, I will not elaborate on them here. Both the Soviets and the Czechoslovaks took pains to explain to Egyptian and Syrian officials that the reason for their defeat was not the Soviet training, but rather the lack of it. Consequently, Soviet and Czechoslovak presence within the Syrian and Egyptian armies must grow. Grechko, in a conversation he conducted with Amin Hawedi, the newly appointed Egyptian Minister of War, which took place at the end of October 1967, told him that Soviet advisors must be present within the lower levels of command and not just the senior ones. Grechko claimed that armies of Warsaw Pact members went through a similar process. First, there was a Soviet advisor in each of the command levels. Then, when these armies had improved, most of the Soviet advisors left and the rest stayed only within the senior levels of command. He also urged Hawedi to send more pilots for training in the Soviet Union. Likewise, General Miroslav Smoldash, special assistant to the Czechoslovak Chief of Staff, explained to General Muhammad Fauzi, Egyptian Chief of Staff, at the end of June 1967 that the main problem during the war was the lack of technical and tactical knowledge by the Egyptian troops, and that therefore Egyptians must allow the Czechoslovaks to send additional experts to Egypt who would help to train them properly. Another person who was willing to use the Egyptian defeat was Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB. In a conversation with Hawedi, who was also Minister of Intelligence, which took place again in Moscow at the end of October 1967, Andropov said that some of the reasons for the results of the June War was the lack of cooperation between their two respective intelligence services. That should change, he told Hawedi. Hawedi agreed with him. Then Andropov informed Hawedi that the KGB recently discovered that the Americans were able to read Egyptian encrypted messages and speculated that the Americans must have passed whatever information they have learned to the Israelis. Sakharovsky, head of the International Department of the KGB, who also took part in that meeting, told Hawedi that the Soviets could help the Egyptians fix that problem. Andropov said he was also interested in exchanging intelligence about Israel and conducting joint operations against American officials in Egypt or other countries. Hawedi said he would be most happy to strengthen cooperation regarding both Israel and encryption, and said the Egyptian intelligence could be most helpful in conducting operations in Egypt and Africa. Hawedi was not the only one who was willing to agree to Soviet requests for greater cooperation. Czechoslovak officials who visited Cairo at the end of June reported that there was an ongoing purge of senior officers. Those who left were replaced mainly with officers who were trained either in Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union. Indeed, they reported that the new commander of the Egyptian Air Force, Marshal Eza, was able to converse in Russian and had replaced the picture of Marshal Ammer, which was hanged in the office during the time of his predecessor, with a picture of Marshal Vereshinin, head of the Soviet Air Force. Moreover, not only did the Egyptians not want to close the Czechoslovak-run Military Technical Academy in Cairo, but they also asked to enlarge it by adding a department for tactical studies, although in the past, that is before the war, they refused Czechoslovak requests to do so. In conclusion, it seems that Soviets and Egyptians did not want the May-June crisis to end in a war. Rather, they were hoping that the crisis would end peacefully. Both sides thought that the Egyptian military presence in the Sinai should be maintained. When that plan was thwarted by Israeli surprise attack and the ensuing successful military campaign, the Soviets decided to use the situation in order to enlarge their presence within the Egyptian and the Syrian armies. It seems that this Soviet initiative was gladly accepted both in Cairo and Damascus, as in both places there was a dire need of military aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. I think these presentations have really given us a broad spectrum of perspectives on the beginning of the war, in particular the Soviet role, spiked with some new documents and personal reminiscences. I'd like to give the speakers, the authors, opportunity to respond, but would also very much like to then get to the Q&A and get comments from the audience. Do you immediately want to respond, or should we take some questions?
Take the questions
Take
first.
some questions first? Okay, very good. Well, then the floor is open. If you could wait for the mic, and please note your affiliation or identify yourself prior to speaking. I would ask you also to be succinct. We have only a limited amount of time, and I'd like to give as many people a chance as possible. Questions, comments? Yes. We'll start with this gentleman down here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I do not happen to be Middle Eastern expert or Soviet expert.
Hold on, we need to make sure the mic is on.
Thank you. And I also have not read the books, unfortunately, but I happened to participate in a war as a young...
Could you speak into the mic so that...
I'm speaking. People hear me? Okay, thank you. I happened to participate in a war as a young lieutenant, and I'd like to share some of my personal views about the beginning and the aftermath of the war. Before the war, the country was like a coiled spring ready for action. As you recall, President Johnson, prior to the war, mentioned that Israel will not be alone if it doesn't go it alone. And despite his assuring comments, the leadership, Levi, Eshkol, and the military decided to embark on a preemptive action. It was mentioned here. On the breakfast on the morning of June the 5th, 309 out of 340 Egyptian planes were destroyed on the ground. And as related to, as mentioned earlier, the Egyptian planes were supplied by the Soviet Union. The jet fighter was the MiG, dubbed by NATO Farmer.
If you could focus on your question or your very personal experience.
Okay.
But
experiences.
We can't give sort of a history.
Okay. Well, anyway, the MiG and the Tupolev 16 and the Ilyushin, and facing them on the Israeli side were the jet fighter, the Mirage, the Vautour, and the Nord, French-made, and so on. The tank corps approached the Sinai in 3 columns, and on June the 8th reached the Suez Canal. I have some pictures, by the way, taken. I'll be glad to share them at the reception that I took from the Suez Canal and the desert. Basically, the 2 main advantages Israeli had were, number one, they were familiar with the terrain and the fortification from the 56 war. 11 years earlier, the commanders, Israel Tal and Avraham Yoffe, they knew the area very well. Secondly, as noted in the memoirs of Gamassi, after the war, the Egyptian command gave conflicting orders to go back and forth. I
really need you to come to your question.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, anyway, in the aftermath of the war, bitter fruit for winner and loser alike, Israel quadrupled in size, secure borders, Lebanon mountains, Sinai Desert served as a buffer, added 2 million people, became regional superpower. On the other hand, overblown confidence, euphoria, superiority of the Arabs led to 71 war of attrition, intelligence failure in 73, Yom Kippur War, and finally to 1979 Camp David Accord. I enjoyed the presentation. I have no question.
Okay. Thank you, and I apologize for having to be brief. Okay.
My name's Howard Moreland. In your theory, what was the scenario in which Israel would be disarmed of nuclear weapons? Were the Soviets expecting, in your theory, were they expecting Egyptian army to capture Dimona and then disarm it? Or how was that supposed to work, and why did it not work?
Thank you. If you could return the mic to my colleagues here.
Would you prefer us to gather all the questions?
No,
and then
go ahead.
answer,
Go and respond.
Well, we think that the proposed action would be, if Israel would be defeated, and there will be some political interference and management of the results, it would be, first of all, demanded to go back to the partition borders and to demolish Dimona itself. If it won't be bombed during the war itself, because it was marked, and we have a map here in our book of the Egyptian map with the Dimona as the center, as a target there. So this is what we envisage. But of course, look, we deal only with facts. We don't want to speculate what could be, because it's still speculation.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panelists on this?
On this particular question, no.
Yeah. No? Okay, then we'll go to next question. The gentleman over here to the right, and then we'll jump to the left side.
I wanted to get this panel's reaction to present
If you could
news.
identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Joel Wishingrad, Senior Correspondent of World Media Report's WMR News. I wanted to get this panel's reaction to the modern news. I've just come from a State Department press briefing this afternoon, and it's 40 years after the impact of the Six-Day War. And there were remarks about the buildup today of the Syrian army. And it's almost like deja vu. You have President Bush meeting Putin, and all eyes are on both Iraq and Afghanistan, whereas before you were commenting the eyes were on the Vietnam War. And, of course, it's the Russians that helped build the reactor in Iran, and also their black box commercial contracts. The Iranians apparently have built a torpedo factory with Russian help. So I wanted to know what the scenario was in comparison 40 years ago to what's occurring directly, perhaps right now, under our eyes.
Well, if I may say, somebody very clever said once that the history of the historical event can be, for the first time, a tragedy, and for this, when it repeats itself, it's become a farce. So things do not repeat themselves just in the same way. And maybe there is some deja vu element in their situation, but we are dealing only with the event of 40 years ago. So I don't think that we are qualified to comment, especially on the briefings that we didn't hear what was said there.
Thank you, Isabella. I would like us to focus on the events that the authors and panelists have talked and written about. So, yes, over here.
My name is Stephen Shore. Two very brief questions. First is, what was behind the Egyptian decision to close the straits, which were viewed at the time as the immediate cause of the Israeli preemption? And has your research covered any more information about the attack on the USS Liberty?
We knew that would come sometime. Let me take the Liberty first. Okay, Bella, if you want. We don't attempt to answer the question why the Liberty was attacked. And the chapter that we do have in the book on the Liberty incident is there because, due to the many discussions and arguments and debates over the Liberty incident over the years, more has come to light about the Soviet aspect in connection with the Liberty incident than on anything else. So that we know now and can state for certain, even though, as I said, it's still being sanitized in official documents, that the Liberty was sent into the Mediterranean primarily in order to monitor Soviet communications.
Could you just, for the non-special...
Yes, the USS Liberty was a United States intelligence ship that arrived off the Sinai coast on June 8th, and within a few hours was attacked by Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats, seriously damaged. There were quite a number of casualties, and this has been a matter of some controversy to this day, mainly because the Liberty's survivors, who are very embittered, claim that Israel did this deliberately for various reasons they have proposed. Israel has always claimed that it was done inadvertently and apologized, paid some compensations and so on, but the incident lives. And in fact, tomorrow there's the 40th anniversary reunion of the Liberty survivors, and I expect you'll read about that. These charges will be renewed. One of them, by the way, only one, agreed to meet us to discuss the Soviet aspect of their mission. and he is taking a copy of our book down to their reunion, and we are eagerly awaiting the responses. But so the Liberty was obviously sent in primarily to monitor Soviet communications. We can only speculate whether it was the sudden appearance of this awesome new aircraft, which was unfamiliar to the West, that was one of the considerations behind this, because it followed a few days the first overflight of Dimona. By the way, let me now just state in response to Ambassador Parker, yes, there were Egyptian planes in these flights too. We know this for sure because signals were picked up by the Israelis of at least one panicky Egyptian MiG-21 pilot landing in Bir Gafgafa after making one of these flights. But we know also from the later appearances of the MiG-25 during and after the War of Attrition that because of its vulnerability on takeoff at lower speeds and lower altitude, it was always escorted by MiG-21s. So that those MiG-21s could definitely have been Egyptian. In fact, one we know for sure was. So that could perhaps reconcile the versions. To get back to the Liberty. We know also that there were quite a number of Soviet ships in the immediate vicinity of the Liberty. The entire body of the Sixth Fleet has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean after Nasser accused the Sixth Fleet aircraft of taking part in the Israeli initial attack. So there was no U.S. vessel within 400 miles of the Liberty. And the first vessel to arrive and propose supposedly assistance to the Liberty was a Soviet destroyer. We know of several others that were in that immediate area, say within a radius of 50 miles. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons that Israel is consistently given for the torpedo boats attack was that they picked up twice radar signals of a vessel steaming at 30 knots, which immediately classified it as a hostile target, while the Liberty was capable of 17 knots. And the Americans then found it hard to accept such an error, and we find it unlikely that such an error could have been made, but we do advance for further investigation. We can't say that we have any hard evidence on this, whether this was a case of mistaken identity, and there even beckons the conspiracy theory that the Soviets were intentionally luring the Israelis to attack the Liberty, because we do know that the Soviets were aware of the Liberty's presence in the Mediterranean from the moment it crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, because the Liberty reported encountering 3 Soviet vessels, 2 of which we have identified as the counterparts of the Liberty, intelligence vessels also. Now, for all of this, we don't propose any theory of our own as to why Israel attacked the Liberty, but the Liberty incident illustrates for us the massive presence of the Soviets in the area, the fact that the U.S. was very much aware of it and very much interested in it, and the fact also the U.S. is completely blacking out this aspect of the situation to this very day. That's about what we can say about the Liberty.
Thank you, Gideon. Ambassador Parker?
The answer was there anything new on the Liberty? I don't think there is. I haven't seen it. The survivors are having a demonstration on Capitol Hill tomorrow, I believe. What I think they want is a congressional hearing. They contend that there has never been a proper investigation, by which they mean a hearing in the Capitol where a senator or a congressman is grilling people about what happened. But I'm not aware of any new, quote, new information.
Okay, thank you. And
there was another question.
Right, your first question.
Closing of the
Straits.
Closing of Tirana Straits. Well, we have been present to a very interesting lecture a couple of weeks ago in Tel Aviv University, dealing with the problem of Israeli energy supplies. And it appears that most, if not all, of the oil supply to Israel at the time was moving through the Tirana Straits to Eilat. So obviously, if you cut such an important artery, energy artery, to the whole country, you are nudging Inc. to act in its self-defense. And that the closure of the Tirana Straits have been declared as a casus belli by Abba Eban, I think, about immediately after effect after the 56 Suez Sinai campaign. So it can be said that it was a deliberate act, also motivated by the desire to provoke Israel into an action. When Israel didn't react immediately to this action and just waited, decided to wait and go on with this closure, then came Foxbats.
Let me just add that the Americans put it to the Soviets several times. If your question is, did the Soviets put the Egyptians up to it? No. This was put at the times on several occasions by Americans to various Soviet sources, and they never got a hard and fast answer on it. It was never hard and fast denied by the Soviets. We don't have documentary evidence to prove directions from the Soviets to the Egyptians close the straits. But we believe in the speech by Brezhnev on June 20th, when he said that we gave them the warning about the supposed troop concentrations so that they should take the appropriate measures. We think we have pretty good evidence to show that this was one of the appropriate measures.
Well, I think that we also should have taken into consideration that the Soviets would never confirm any step like a closure of Tirana Straits, because if someone can close the straits to another party, Turkey could do it to the Soviets, closing the Turkish Straits. So this was a very touchy subject.
Ambassador Parker?
Well, I was going to say that an important factor in the Egyptian action was the criticism they were getting from the Jordanians, among others, for hiding behind UNIF, that they weren't really sincere in their efforts to support the cause of the Palestinians, because they were letting Israel live peacefully behind UNIF. Marshal Amr had there's a history of Marshal Amr wanting to call for the withdrawal of UNIF and to close the Strait of Tiran. And their position was, once they were there, once they had troops on the ground, they couldn't allow the Israelis to pass through freely.
Dr. Roy?
I find it difficult to believe, excuse me, that the Soviets were behind that, because the Soviet ambassador was told by Nasser that he just announced the closure of the straits, and he immediately wrote back home that he had no prior knowledge of it. So I find that rather difficult to, even if we accept that Brezhnev's speech 4 weeks later was concocted and cannot be believed completely, I think an announcement by, not an announcement, a diplomatic report by the ambassador to Moscow that he'd just been informed and he hadn't known about it beforehand, I think corroborates that position.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the gentleman down here.
Yes,
could you wait for the microphone, please, and identify yourself?
Mr. Arim, as you mentioned...
But please identify yourself.
My name is Emil Simiu. I'm with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has nothing to do with the 67 war.
Have technology, I don't know about standards.
Mr. Arim, as you mentioned in passing, that there was a secret agreement in 1962 between Romania and the United States that had some bearing on subsequent events. Would it be appropriate to ask
Yes,
for more details?
By all means. This is mentioned in a book by Lawrence. No, his first name. Raymond Gardhoff, who was an assistant to Dean Rusk. In his memoirs of the Cold War, an assistant to Dean Rusk, in his memoirs of the Cold War, he says that Rusk confided to him that following the Cuban crisis, not during the Cuban crisis, following the Cuban crisis, Corneliu Mănescu, the Romanian foreign minister, concluded a secret agreement with Rusk whereby if another such crisis erupts that threatens to turn into a nuclear exchange between the two superpowers, Romania is opting out and should not be targeted.
This was published in the Cold War Project Bulletin some years ago.
So this is rather well known. we think that in following the events in the conference of Warsaw Pact leaders on June 10th, that resulted 9/10, that resulted in the severance of diplomatic relations by all the Warsaw Pact members except Romania. That the record there reflects that the Romanians at the last moment pulled out of this thing, and in this activated this agreement. By not severing relations, this was a signal to the United States that, okay, as we agreed, we're opting out. The one reason we say this is, in a previous case, for instance, when the Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations with Israel, Bulgaria took over as a protecting power. Because then it was decided that the situation did not warrant the entire Warsaw Pact severing relations. In this case...
The Warsaw Pact did not yet exist.
Sorry, the Eastern Bloc, you're right. Now, in 1967, as we found the evidence of, Finland was selected in advance to be the protecting power before relations were severed. Oh, we didn't mention this time. There's a document, a very curious document, as Professor Ori has called it, in the collection of Soviet Foreign Ministry documents, which puts a cover letter on the Soviet protest of June the 5th, which was actually handed directly to Israel. There's a cover letter in this collection of documents sending it supposedly to the Finnish embassy to transfer it to the Israelis as if relations had already been severed. And we think we prove in the book that this proves that the severance of diplomatic relations was prepared in advance and was originally expected to occur on June 5th. But Finland was selected evidently because that was the closest nation that would remain with diplomatic relations with Israel. If they had known in advance that Romania was not severing relations, it would probably have been Romania. So that we think that this agreement was followed up on in this crisis.
Over here.
Amin Garbi, Osgood Center, John Hopkins. I just want to ask, although it's a contrafactual history, so wasn't it for those two reconnaissance flights, this war would have never broken out, or just there were too many subplots that this will happen sooner or later? Because it seems like from your whole book that this story particularly sort of upped the ante at some point, that this was inescapable. Thanks.
Well, we know for sure. There's been an excellent book published by Ami Gluska containing the records of the Israeli cabinet and general staff meetings, which were given to him, although they remain classified. And some of it was censored, but much of it came out. And we know that these two overflights, particularly the second one, caused immense consternation. Now, whether Israel, perhaps, let's say, had Israel not only suspected a grand Soviet design, which we know it did from the diplomatic exchanges that went on, but also suspected that this design included drawing Israel into a first strike, and therefore would have refrained from a first strike, that's already two counterfactual questions. Okay, that's getting a bit complicated. So we'd rather refrain from what would have happened. We know that these overflights definitely were a major factor, if not the major factor, in pushing first for the change of of government in Israel, and then for the decision to go to war, etc. That we can say for sure. What might have happened otherwise, if they hadn't taken place, is very hard to say. Thank you.
I would really love to hear from Avner Cohen, who is one of the foremost experts on the Israeli nuclear issue, at some point in the discussion. But let me turn all the way to the back, the microphone. Mr. Granville, all the way in the back, all the way in the back.
Red Austin, two questions, if I may. Excuse me, two questions, if I may.
Granville Austin, yeah.
Yeah, Granville Austin.
Yeah.
Two questions for the panel, if I may, and particularly for Ambassador Parker. One, there was some thinking at this time, after Nasser had closed the States of Tehran, that his mouth simply may have run away with him. In other words, he was giving a speech, and in the speech was all all about how we're going to win and the terrible Israelis and how grand we are. And the thought was that he was so entranced by his own hyperbole that he simply closed the straits and sort of woke up to the consequences of that somewhat later. The second question is, I thought from the material that I saw when I was in the department at the time, and this is relative to the Liberty, that the Israeli aircraft surveilled, if that's the right term, the Liberty for at least 3 hours.
Yes.
If that is true, and do you know what evidence there is for or against that, because I remember it as being true, it would be very difficult to misunderstand what the Liberty was if you're flying around looking at it for 3 hours or more.
Well, it wasn't the same plane. There were a number of Israeli flights that passed over the Liberty. It wasn't the same plane circling the Liberty, but otherwise you're right. Again, it's not our purpose to explain the attack on the Liberty. We're using the Liberty incident as an illustration of the centrality of the Soviet element. Whether, say, one of the Israeli flights picked out a Soviet destroyer, radioed it home, it was radioed back to the TBE boats, and they went out and struck the Liberty instead, for instance. These are all speculations we don't want to get into. You're absolutely right that the Liberty was under surveillance, and you're absolutely right that the Israelis have a lot to explain. Sorry.
The plane was surveilled by the Israelis. They noted its number, they identified it, and they had a card on their plotting board at the headquarters at Haifa. I mean, this is the Israeli explanation. When during the lunch break, there was a change of shifts, and somebody removed this tag. And so then when the ship was reported later, they assumed that the Liberty had gone on. They had no idea it was still around. And this was actually a question of Israeli incompetence. That is why they missed it the second time.
What about the straits?
The first part of the question, yeah.
What was that?
Question on the straits.
I don't have any comment on that, except that, of course, he would have had a chance to back down, but you could perhaps say that he wasn't suited in character to do that.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I directed this to Ambassador Parker was because he was in Cairo, and he's a long-time fluent speaker of Arabic.
Well, Nasser wasn't speaking to me.
Come on.
Yeah, well, he often I think he got carried away. Nasser was not at all. You know, we have an image here where he's somebody like Hitler. Not at all. I used to listen to Hitler when I was in high school. Nasser speaking sort of as the father of the family, in a very quiet conversational voice, with a sense of humor, and sometimes if the audience liked what he said, he'd get carried away, like as speakers often do. But I think the principal reason we saw at this point, he didn't. As someone said, Abba Eban had declared when they called for the withdrawal of UNIF that as long as they did not close the Strait of Tehran, there wouldn't be any war. Well, that would be sort of a challenge to Nasser, and he didn't think the Israelis were as strong as they were. He thought that he could handle them, and he didn't think a threat of war would be all that important. At this point, he had a very unreal understanding of the strength of Egypt and Israel.
Thank you. Avner Cohen.
Well, since Christian asked me to say something, I was a little reluctant to say, because first, I'm not Soviet expert, and I think the issue today is about Soviet intention interpretations, and I don't feel qualified to talk about that. I would say two things. I mean, one, to begin with, I mean, there are 2 or 2.5 incompatible versions of Soviet behavior on this table. It will be interesting, I think, for the benefits of all of us. I mean, there is the mainstream view, which I think has been strengthened and perhaps has been deepened by Yaakov Roy and by Guy. And there is unconventional view with some very intriguing material, which has been put here forward by Gideon and Isabella, friends of mine. It will be interesting to have direct dialogue. Obviously, I understand they're not compatible. They're not just two different interpretations, but they're incompatible. It will be interesting to have some discussion between these two things. That's one. About the Israeli nuclear program, I would say 2 or 3 things. One is, it is true that Israel was fast on technology, and by 65, 66, a great deal of the work to develop nuclear weapons has been already achieved. However, my personal view is that in 67, weeks or even days before the war started, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol politically was still undecided. There were, of course, events that took place that in many ways overwhelmed politics, technology in many, but it was because of the drama of the crisis. But there was a gap between technology and politics. So the mysterious message, or whatever it was, between Sneh, Chubachin, the Soviets, and Israel is very mysterious, because I think Prime Minister Eshkol at the time, for one thing, it would be sabotaging to give that kind of message to the Soviet. But for another thing, I don't think that he himself knows politically where he's going to be in 2 years. And it takes quite a while until that message has been translated, according to this version, into some actions. So there is something very strange about that. Yes, the world was full of rumors that Israel is about to develop, and this was in the open literature, nuclear weapons. But this, I don't read it as a direct intelligence message. So I have major issue, and I told Isabella and Gideon, their friends, about my problem with this piece of evidence. The other thing is, one should be clear that what is presented here is a radical different interpretation of the behavior and conduct of the Soviets in the context of the Cold War. I mean, this is a totally reckless behavior, if it's true. It could lead to a third world war. And one wonder, I mean, for one thing, where is some sort of deliberation? I think there is something here that leads us to conspiracy theory, and most academics, maybe they have bias against conspiracy theory. And one wonder, where is the evidence? I mean, I agree that a great deal sometimes is not being left on paper, and there is no paper trail. But when there is such a vast conspiracy theory, one wonder, where is something? And so far, in terms of motivation, in terms of politics at the high level, they have very intriguing data at the mid-level, as Gideon put it, perhaps tens or hundreds of elements in a puzzle of 10,000 of them, but we don't have anything at the top. And that's a problem. So that's my broad issues with this.
Well, first of all, I have a question, Avner. Do you have on the top level any document about Israeli nuclear program?
Yes.
You have?
To some extent, and definitely I have some.
Well, to some extent, we also have some documents, Soviet documents from the highest level, but also to some extent. But if you excise the Israeli nuclear program from the documentary evidence needed, you can excise anything else. This is the first point. And the second point, well, now I think Gideon will take up the second point.
About the irresponsibility of the Soviet action that we... well, first of all, I'm delighted that Yaakov and we can agree, at least on the fact that the Soviet Union acted in 67 much less responsibly than we thought before. Okay, so much agreed. Now, the Soviet Union tried something similar in Cuba before, did something similar in Afghanistan afterwards, and did exactly the same in the Middle Eastern arena 3 years later. So, direct military intervention risking a superpower clash. Okay, so why this astonishment? So that I don't see, this problem I do not see. Now, you're absolutely right that we have a problem here. I'd say we're trying to dig a tunnel, and we're starting out from two opposite ends, and we're not meeting in the middle. Guy and Yaakov have the documents, and the example of the Badran talks is an excellent one. According to the documents that Guy has, and I'd be delighted to read them.
In Arabic.
Well, whatever.
In your translation.
In our translation, nothing happened there. Nothing happened. I mean, Badran came convinced, and for 4 days of deliberations, nothing happened. In this time, the second overflight of Dimona, be it Egyptian or Soviet, was undertaken, a grossly provocative act by any standards, when both of the parties there had agreed they weren't going to risk a war. Now we have the testimonies of Soviet participants in these talks, which is exactly the opposite. Pavel Akopov, among others, who was later the #2 man in the embassy in Egypt during the War of Attrition, said that Badran came with the maps, with a dateline for the operation on the 26th, and 3 times pleaded for clearance to go ahead with the preemptive strike. And 3 times the Soviets prevailed on him not to do it, to wait, not to cancel it entirely. The conventional theory has been that the Soviets prevailed upon Nasser not to attack Israel at all. We think it was just to postpone it, and according to a recent Russian version that we've seen, it was indeed postponed till June 7th, not canceled entirely. So we have conflicting versions. But you're starting the tunnel from the top. We're starting from the bottom. Good. And indeed, if any, not only all, if any of the indications that we have of Soviet actions that were not only planned, but activated and in some cases actually implemented. We know of at least one Marine landing that was actually done. Okay? We know of these MiG overflights over Israel, which were actually done. We have the evidence now, official confirmation from the Russian Air Force, plus the testimonies of the 2 pilots who actually did it. I don't think we can expect better than that. Now, somehow these tunnels don't meet. Now the question is, whom you believe more? When you have minutes of discussions, for a later period, we have a case of the so-called expulsion of so-called Soviet advisors from Egypt in '72. Okay? We have first the memoirs of Kissinger, and then the records of the conversations between him and Gromyko over the years, which now became and they don't, first of all, they don't fit. But second, in one of the climactic discussions of this issue, just at the Moscow summit in '72, there's a very detailed record of the conversation, which is very revealing in itself. And then the 2 ministers adjourned for a 20-minute tete-a-tete. No record. And just before that, the 2 say, so we've reached an agreement which will include some oral understandings. No record of the oral understandings. So we say, we're going to try and piece together the picture of what the Soviets actually did. And you piece of what the Soviets actually intended. And for the present, these 2 pictures don't match. And I think we're going to have to continue working to try and make those 2 tunnels meet somewhere. But for the time being, I agree, we have a problem. And so you either believe the evidence or you believe the documents. And I tend to believe the evidence.
The discussion brings out some of the issues. This is good. Yaakov, Guy, would you like to respond directly to this?
I'd just like to address the question of the second pilot. First of all, he was in Egypt in 1970, 1971, and when he was interviewed about his feats and so on and so forth, he never mentioned the 1967 incident at all. He only talked about 1970, 1971, so I doubt that we can say that he took part in this one. Also, the announcement of the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman speaks of the flight of a MiG-25RB, which did not yet exist in 1967. It only came into existence in 1970. There was first of all an R and then a B, that is for reconnaissance and for bombing, and the same initials in Russian as in English, so it's okay to use R and B. And they only combined the two in 1970. So again, I think that must have been a mistake of the Russian Defense Ministry. I don't see how we can clear that up, but the way I see it anyway, it is a mistake. I agree, but we do have the other testimony, which I cannot discount.
Thank you. Guy?
Okay. First of all, I want to counter the claim that academics don't love conspiracy theories. I, for one, really love them. And I became in love with the theory that there was a struggle in the Kremlin between Brezhnev and Kosygin on the one hand and Grechko on the other. But I haven't seen anything in the material that I saw that validates that. There's nothing that I've seen that proves that Grechko was instigating a war in the Middle East. What I find really surprising is that there's nothing about it in the Czech material, because Czechoslovakia was a major ally of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And there's absolutely nothing about it. There were military missions, Czechoslovak military missions, going around in the area in April and May. Nothing about some sort of special Soviet presence in the Mediterranean. There is also nothing about it in Arab sources.
May I make a suggestion? I think in order to make it easier for our two tunnels to meet, let's stop treating the absence of evidence as proving anything. Okay? Let's just take positive evidence, either documentary or factual, and as proving perhaps something. But the lack of evidence for something to have happened, I suggest we clear that out. We've tried, at least in our research and book, to eliminate these suggestions that we're discounting this because nothing to this effect has ever been found. It may be found someday, maybe not. Let's try and concentrate on what we do have rather than what we haven't found.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. On the right side, Alberto Tonini, over there.
Thank you. My name is Alberto Tonini. I am from the University of Florence, Italy. If we assume that the Soviet plan was to neutralize or to destroy Israeli nuclear power, can we find any evidence of the Soviet intention after 1967 to provide Egypt with any nuclear facilities in order to counterbalance Israeli nuclear capabilities?
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, give you a moment to think about it. The gentleman in the back there.
Yosef Bodansky. A few comments, running quickly. A, these were MiG-25. Israeli Air Force ran comparison of the flight profiles after the MiG-25s were identified during the war of attrition. The profiles were identical. Number two, as far as the issues of GRU, the knowledge of the Russian embassies about, or Soviet embassies at the time about this and that, Vinograd being surprised by the eviction of the advisors, etc. The real communication between the Soviet guys who were doing the job and the Kremlin or Moscow were done by the KGB and the GRU. The diplomats were kept in the dark intentionally so that they can lie and cheat for the country honorably without a blink of the eye. That happened during the Middle East, that happened in Afghanistan, happened in Korea, happened in Vietnam, happened in the Horn of Africa and all other parts of the third world that the Soviets were involved in. They were always parallel. I've seen very, very few exceptions, and that's the practitioners talking. As far as the Egyptian reports about meetings of one kind or another, I don't know. I haven't seen the document that you talk about, and so won't comment about them. But I've seen Egyptian reports about conversation about which I have intimate knowledge. They were lying to the teeth. They were reporting to the masters what they thought the masters would like to hear, as opposed to what was said or done in the room. So I'd be extremely careful about dealing with that.
I think we'll have to.
Two very brief. Number one, the Egyptian contingency plans that were supported, developed with the Soviet advisors were all offensive in nature. There were no defensive contingency plans. Israel captured a lot. The other collection of these contingency plans. So if the Egyptians were supposed, as you suggest, to just hold out to, the military would have been provided with contingency plans to hold the ground, defensive ones rather than offensive. Last, the GRU expected Israel to be destroyed at the end of the Six-Day War. Well before the war, these were the expectations of the studies they've done.
Be very curious to see the evidence for that as well. We'll take a couple more questions in the center here, and then the gentleman right to the next, and then we'll turn it over for a final round of comments by all of our panelists.
This is a fascinating discussion, and I think that if you just look at
you could please identify yourself.
Vladi Rosenbaum. If you just look at the June the 20th plenary meeting and the record of it, which we really don't have in the original, there are copies in translations, and I had looked at one of those from Polish, and I noticed that there are some discrepancies from the interpretation that we had in the bulletin here a couple of years ago and the Polish version of it. So that's one thing that we should look really and find the original, the Russian original if we can. But there's also something else here, that there are reports about this meeting from various sources, and one of them is Petro Shelest, who was a Politburo member at the time, and who published memoirs. Actually, I don't know how many copies. I suspect that nothing is available now because I found about him the memoirs, and particularly the issue that we're discussing here, in Flot Ukraine, which is one of the papers that nobody reads, I guess, except that people who serve in the Navy, Ukrainian Navy. So he specifically talks about the plenary meeting and the circumstances why Yegoryshev was removed from his position the same day. And what he proposed, he was the he was the party chief in Moscow at that time. What he proposed was that the Soviet Union should immediately launch an attack against Israel. And second, he also criticized severely the Soviet Defense Committee, of which Brezhnev was a member. What happened, by the end of the meeting, he was no longer chief of the Moscow Party Committee. He was immediately sent to a minister's position of a ministry which was in a big trouble, agriculture, machinery ministry, something like that. Okay. And he disappeared. So, and the other thing, just quickly, there are Polish sources also that you need to look at. There is evidence from some high-level Polish diplomats who participated in some of those talks, for example, at the June 10 meeting in Moscow, the summit meeting. So they are very revealing as well. And I submitted some of those things actually to here.
Well, we hope to be publishing some of these documents, including some of the ones that the panelists have referred to in a future issue of the bulletin and also on our website. But now to the gentleman.
Yes, Morris Wolf. I've been the legal counsel for the Wallenberg family, and I've been boring into Russian diplomatic history from my own vantage point, and the whole idea of reliability of Russian official documents is deeply, deeply suspect. Even the report of Wallenberg's death, we now find out that the man who allegedly made the report had actually retired 3 or 4 months before someone signed his name to the trumped-up report suggesting Wallenberg's death in 1947. So we see this whole concept of penaloka, which is let's fool the foreigner. And it shouldn't be any surprise. It's not boring 2 tunnels. Maybe it's more complex 3. Diplomats are trained at times to lie. Pearl Harbor, the Japanese diplomats were told to lie to Roosevelt and Hull about the plans. So it comes as no surprise that we as sophisticated scholars and students find this idea that reports are untrue. I mean, they're trained to be untrue, and I'm not casting any aspersions on any honorable member of any diplomatic corps at this time. It's just history, okay? So if we take reality as it is, we have to take a sophisticated approach that we're not going to look at documents and think their face value has value. We have to really look at the facts of what happened. So with that comment, I'd just like to add a third tunnel that you can connect.
Well, if I may add, if you remember 62, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Leonid Zorin, the Soviet ambassador to UN, was saying that there are no Soviet missiles in Cuba, and at the time, the Khrushchev's open speech through the radio to Kennedy was broadcast on the radio. So, most of the Soviet diplomats of this level, of the ambassadorial level, they were directly subordinated to the party, but not to the foreign ministry. They were reporting to Brezhnev or Khrushchev and giving the instructions, receiving the instructions from Politburo, and maybe sometimes through the foreign minister, but the instructions came from the Politburo.
Thank you.
I might just add that you mentioned the Japanese in Pearl Harbor and so forth. It's not only the bad guys who do it. I'm not making any. Okay.
Would you like to respond to some of the other questions or comments we got? Alberto Tonini's question about.
Okay. I just wanted to respond to two questions by Mr. Bodonsky. Okay. About Egyptian lying through their teeth. The document I'm speaking about was published by Amin Hawedi. It's the original transcript. You see the photocopy. So I don't think it's forgery. And in any sense, let's assume, and in any case, let's assume they were lying through their teeth, and it was written to gratify, or it was written in order that some senior official would be pleased with the document. It only strengthened my point, because if it was written in order to satisfy, I don't know who, Nasser or Badran, how come the content of the conversation is so, let's call it peacenik or peaceful? The other thing I wanted to comment about was whether the Egyptian army in Sinai had offensive or defensive structure. I only invite you to read an article by Roland Popp that was published recently in the Middle East Journal. And according to CIA secret estimations, it was a defensive structure.
According to the CIA estimations, there were no nuclear weapons in the Middle East in 1967. Richard Helms reported this on May 24th in the Situation Room. So with due respect to the CIA, apparently their performance vis-a-vis Iraq was not much of a change to what happened in 67.
Okay, any other comments?
I would just like to answer Alberto Tonini about the continuation. We don't think that the Soviet Union would provide nuclear weapons to any of its Arab allies, because it doesn't look that it would be the Soviet policy to let nuclear weapons out of its own hand. They made mistake one with China. They wouldn't like to make it again. But we have seen in some of the documents of reports that the nuclear issue vis-a-vis Israel has been mentioned later on, after the Six-Day War. First of all, in '68, the Soviet ambassador in London mentioned that Soviet Union has been cannot forgive the Israel two major capital sins. One of it, refusal to join the NPT, and the second is Israeli threat to bomb to take out the Aswan High Dam, probably with the nuclear arms. Then, on the height of the war of attrition, I just don't remember at the moment at what country, but two Soviet diplomats have been telling an Israeli diplomat that the next round of fighting will be done with the nuclear arms, implying that the arms on the other side would be Soviet arms. I hope it answers at least partially your question.
We do know of some Egyptian feelers toward the Soviet Union. Every time that the Israeli nuclear issue came to the fore in the media and elsewhere, about feeling, what would be your response if we requested countervailing nuclear weapons? And there were feelers from the Egyptians toward the Soviets at various stages from 1960 onwards about countervailing nuclear weapons if the Israelis obtained them. And to the best of our knowledge, the response was always negative. I mean, the Soviets did not make an exception for Egypt to the rule of not spreading nuclear weapons to any of their allies.
Ambassador Parker would like to make some remarks, and then also...
Well, I have to say that I made a serious effort some years ago to write a book about what actually happened in 1967. I'm disappointed that it hasn't been passed out to you here so I could sign it, but it's Politics of Miscalculation in the Middle East, University of Indiana Press. This is the first really serious attempt in particular to find out what the Soviets did.
Indeed.
Indeed, yes.
There are several black holes out here. One is in Cairo. We don't know very much about the internal dialogue in Egypt. Syria is really a black hole. We don't know anything at all. There haven't been any memoirs. I tried to see the vice president of Syria some years ago and ask him questions, and he expressed total ignorance. If I just send him a letter and what my questions were, he'd let me know, and I immediately sent him a letter, and I never got an answer, of course. But that's a total black hole. We don't know anything about the Syrians. The Soviets, it seems to me, was another, at least gray hole. We know something, but there are a lot of things we still need to know before we reach any conclusions about what they were up to.
Thank you. I could not agree more. In some ways, these would be good concluding remarks. I should also add, I want to add that Ambassador Parker not only published previously on this subject, but also convened one of the really pioneering conferences on the 67 war, bringing together various perspectives some years ago. But now, Jakob Roy.
Perhaps Ambassador Parker's book will be The Way Our Tunnels Will Meet, because Gideon and Isabella and I, we all agree that his book is important evidence from which we can start our research. I think we have to be careful about the logo of documents versus facts. Not because I think we should believe everything that is written in a document the same way as we don't believe everything that a politician says. We shouldn't believe everything that he writes. But at the same time, that is what we have to work with. So we have to use the documents. I agree we have to check and counter-check as far as we can. We cannot not work with the documents. It is impossible.
Oh, definitely. I'm saying is to not work with the absence of documents. Once you have documents, they definitely have to be worked with. What you cannot deduct from is the absence of documents.
Okay.
And secondly and lastly, I just want to say that I have the Russian version of the Brezhnev speech, and it will be published in translation in English in our book that hopefully will come out in about 6 months' time.
Oh, well, then you've sold a copy.
Very good. Now, before we go and continue this discussion more informally over a glass of wine or soda, I'd like to ask Jordan Bayev just to briefly give us a notice of a new CD-ROM that has been published of new East Bloc evidence, in particular Bulgarian evidence on the Middle East. This will be just brief. If the technology plays along. Jordan, could you come up, please? And then, along with a round of applause for our panelists, with thanks for their stimulating presentations, and thanks to you for your contributions, we'll adjourn to the boardroom across the hall. So, will technology play along? No?
Oh, it's behind. I think we'll go down to the front row.
Yep.
We won't get in anyone's way.
Right behind us. Want to walk down and sit down there? So let's give, in the meantime, let's give the panelists a round of applause.
There is no.
Okay, why don't you start your comment?
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to make a comment or introduction in the title which Christian Osterman made for me, because if we want to understand more the East European position, we should know that there is no unique monolith Eastern Europe. There are, at least in particular for the Middle East policy, two Eastern Europes, Central Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, because of many roots and different historical reasons. In Southern Eastern Europe, there were a lot of connections with this region for 5-6 centuries. First of all, because in the Ottoman Empire, from Habsburg Empire to Egypt and Libya for 5-6 centuries lived together, from Serbia and Bulgaria to Arabic countries, this people, and it was multicultural, multi-ethnic and multi-religious community, so-called. For the first British expression of Near East was included also Bulgaria and Serbia in 19th century. So first we had connection with this region. The second was the different fate of the Jewish population in Europe, because in Southeastern Europe the so-called Sepharad Jews had another fate. They incorporated in our culture, in our societies, in our people, and perhaps you know, most of you know well, that the only people in the Second World War who saved their own part of their societies, Jews, was Bulgaria. About 60,000 of Jews was saved. And I would like here to avail the opportunity to give a present to our colleagues from Tel Aviv University, a new book with about 2,000 documents about this process of Second World War. Well, the next comment of mine before to present you our new documentary multimedia volume, which we published a year ago with contribution and with the support of Woodrow Wilson Center of Cold War International History Project. This is that Bulgaria, in particular, was after the Second World War, during the communist rule, probably the most reliable satellite to Kremlin, to Moscow. That's why we can find now, currently, in our archives, a lot of documents regarding the Soviet position, the Soviet policy, and some kind of testimonies of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and other Soviet politicians and foreign ministers confidentially, they spoke about their policy with Zhivkov, with other Bulgarian politicians. And we found such interesting documents in Zhivkov personal archives. Also, you can find now they are available a lot of documents in Yugoslavian President Tito's personal archives. They are available. Unfortunately, Ceausescu, Romanian communist ruler, his personal records were lost in 1990 somewhere after his so-called trial. Nevertheless, you can find also in what we found in our diplomatic, intelligence and political archives a lot of things regarding Romania and Romanian particular position after 1967. So I just want to show you here in our well, in the last couple of years, in cooperation with Cold War History Project, we published a few volumes of new available Bulgarian documents, of Cold War documents. This was first of Zhivkov personal records. There are some notes, some protocols of his meetings with Arabic leaders. The next one was Bulgarian secret services during the Cold War years. A lot of interesting things regarding the cooperation between KGB and Bulgarian state security in this period. And this was, you can see here in English and Bulgarian by, let me, where is, okay. So here you can find about 250 new documents, which part of them we requested to be declassified last year. In particular, I would like to stress your attention on cables that came from Bulgarian embassies in Tel Aviv, Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, and these other different capitals. And inside there are some interesting things also about the policy, about the personality of some Arabic leaders. It was very interesting confidential portrait that Zhivkov himself made of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and another information regarding the rivalry and tension between Marshal Amer and Gamal Abdel Nasser on the eve of the 6 Days War. And also, what I should say, it was interesting, the diplomatic history of the so-called the corridor history in the United Nations, because in 1966-67 Bulgaria was a non-permanent member of Security Council, United Nations Security Council, and it was total subordination to Kremlin's intentions in this period. You can find inside this documentary volume a lot of evidences, even how it was created, the resolution 242 in October 1967. Also, there are some protocols of on 5th of June 1967, Bulgarian leader Zhivkov made a visit, it was in advance, a prepared visit to Belgrade. And exactly on 5th and 6th in June, he talked a lot with Josip Broz Tito, a friend of Nasser, who received directly information from Cairo. So you can find such kind of information regarding the Yugoslav position, Bulgarian position, and also about information about 9th and 10th of June consultations or discussion in Moscow, of July 1967 discussion also in Moscow, then another discussion in Warsaw. So from this part of documents, researchers and who is interested to receive more information from the East European point of view about the Six-Day War and the consequences of Six-Day War, you can find a lot of new pieces of information, and also of our Ministry of Defense and Intelligence Services conclusions of the consequences of the Six-Day War. They were, of course, confidential, secret documents. They are very critical about the Arabic art of war in this period. So I can say that this is just introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayev. I'd like to invite... By the way, if you're interested in this CD-ROM, contact him at the reception. There's also information on our website about it. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Thanks again to our presenters, Gideon, Isabella, Guy, Ambassador Parker, and Yakov Roy. Please join us for a reception in the boardroom. Thank you.
This is for you, Bulgarian-American relations. It's new. With about 100 documents for breaking the relationship between our countries.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Where is Roy? I want to present him this book.
He's going to be at the reception.
Yes. Okay. So.